Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for returning. We are actually on time, which is quite miraculous at this stage of the day. So my name is Katie Hayward. It's my pleasure and privilege to chair this last session of the afternoon. We have two speakers, as you probably guessed. The topic is Parity of Esteem in Northern Ireland, past, present and future. So the first speaker, I think, will be Tom Flynn, who's a lecturer in Essex Law School. His work focuses on constitutional law and constitutional theory at the subnational, national and transnational levels. His most recent monograph is The Triangular Constitution, Constitutional Pluralism in Ireland, the EU and the ECHR. Colm O'Connor is Professor of Constitutional and Human Rights Law at the Faculty of Laws in UCL. He has published extensively in the areas of equality and non-discrimination law, human rights, and comparative constitutional law. He's also acted as a specialist legal advisor to committees in Westminster and was nominated by the Irish government as a candidate for election as a judge of the European Court of Human Rights in 2024. So I'm looking forward to a lively afternoon following on the rest of the day so far. And over to you, Tom, first of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. In the book of Exodus, the God of Abraham tells his people that he is a jealous God and that they are to have no other gods before him. Now, I hesitate to compare the deity to Hobbes's Leviathan, but I think we could say something quite similar about the jealousy of the state. States are jealous things. They demand the loyalty of their subjects. It's for this reason that so many states have such difficulty with the notion of dual citizenship. And it's for this reason that the political notion of the loyal opposition had such a long and difficult gestation. How can one be loyal to the state if one is actively working against and plotting to undermine those in charge of state policy? The trick, as we now know, is to distinguish between opposition to the policies and tendencies of the party that happens to be in government for the time being and opposition to the fundamentals of the constitutional order. But as it has been developed in the Northern Ireland context and as it appears in the text of the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement, the concept of parity of esteem poses a difficulty, even for our sophisticated modern minds, comfortable as we are with the concept of loyal opposition for ordinary politics. Because the kind of opposition protected by parity of esteem is specifically disloyal. And I use the term disloyal here in its most literal and non-pejorative sense. As we heard earlier from Professor McCrudden, for all its buzzwordiness, the concept of parity of esteem only appears 4 times in the agreement. And in perhaps its most substantive appearance, the British and Irish governments agreed in relevant part, and here I'm going to do what some say you shouldn't do and extract from a larger paragraph what I take to be the essence for present purposes. That the power of the sovereign government with jurisdiction in Northern Ireland, whether this is the UK or Irish government, shall be exercised with rigorous impartiality on behalf of all the people, and shall be founded on, among others, the principles of parity of esteem and of just and equal treatment for the identity, ethos and aspirations of both communities. Now, identity, I think we have a relatively clear idea what it's getting at there. Ethos, I think perhaps less so. I cordially dislike the term ethos. For unrelated reasons, it's used as a kind of a weasel word in the context of education equality jurisprudence in the Republic, but that's neither here nor there. But I think the interesting one here is aspirations. Now, aspirations here has to mean something, and I think from our discussions here today, we're all in agreement that it doesn't mean anything so lowfalutin as having a nice car or a nice TV. It specifically means constitutional aspirations. The desire for Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom or for it to join with the rest of Ireland in a unified republic, though the precise form and nature of that potential republic, unitary but devolved, federal, confederal, is not universally agreed upon. Leonard Cohen once said that there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. And this requirement of the agreement that the state must valorize the desire to leave the state as being worthy of equal respect as the desire to remain within the state is the crack through which I think we can shine light on the idea of parity of esteem and understand it as a constitutional principle. So in my talk here today, I wish to do 3 things. First, I'll set out more specifically what I mean, or what I think I mean, when I say that it's a constitutional principle, and what I mean by constitutional principle. Now, Chris and Ewan have both covered this ground, so I'll try to keep that short. Second, I will argue that both the British and the Irish states, in different ways and for different reasons, as they are currently constituted, have not internalised the concept of parity of esteem as they ought to have done, or as they might have been expected to have done since the agreement, and that we see this in both their legal and political constitutions. And finally, I will sketch out, and I do stress sketch out, a potential way forward or a potential way of thinking about this approach, which I tentatively call aspirational pluralism. So taking, as Chris did, the UCL Constitution Unit's definition of a constitutional principle, they said that they are the values which underlie constitutional or liberal democracy, and that these principles provide a framework within which politics is properly conducted. Now, the key word here is properly, not the framework through which politics must be conducted, but the framework through which politics should be conducted. And I think the distinction here between the is and the ought, the distinction between what you can do and what you should do, is an important one. The Constitution Unit rightly says there's no definitive list of such principles, but that the most fundamental are institutional checks and balances, representative government, the rule of law, the protection of fundamental rights, and integrity and standards in public life. Now, when I think of constitutional pluralism as parity of esteem as a constitutional principle, I'm not making a claim so bold as to say that it's a principle comparable in scope to the principles of representative government or the rule of law. I mentioned a moment ago Leonard Cohen's line about there being a crack in everything. Another great poet, Spike Milligan, once wrote that there are holes in the sky where the rain gets in, but they're ever so small. That's why the rain is thin. The claim I'm making for parity of esteem is a much thinner claim, like Milligan's rain. The claim is that parity of esteem can rightly be called one of the values that underpins or ought to underpin constitutional democracy in Northern Ireland, both as part of the legal constitution and as part of the political constitution. Importantly, this will or ought to remain the case regardless of any future change in the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. So in our blog post on Kemi Badenoch's kneecap decision, Ewan and I wrote that rather than regarding parity of esteem as simply meaning parity or equality, and rather than regarding it as a means by which either community in Northern Ireland can exercise a veto over constitutional change, it's best regarded as a principle of political and cultural recognition, one which, I quote, connotes a durable and ongoing commitment to impartiality on the part of the state between unionists and nationalists. I stress here that that phrasing from the blog post was Ewan's. He was the brains of that operation. Taken seriously, we wrote that this principle therefore, quote, affects the factors that government can lawfully take into account when making decisions which affect people in Northern Ireland. So this is the crack through which parity of esteem shines on the legal constitution. Not as a self-standing, legislatively commanded legal rule, but as an interpretive principle. And I ask your forgiveness here for waxing Dworkinian, but there are only so many undergraduate jurisprudence essays you can mark before they start warping your mind. In the case of the kneecap grant, Section 76 of the Northern Ireland Act makes it unlawful, as Ewan pointed out, for a public authority carrying out functions related to Northern Ireland to discriminate against a person on the grounds of political opinion. This definition of public authority in this context includes a minister of the Crown, and we argued that this duty works alongside the standard common law rules on taking into account irrelevant factors. Therefore, in vetoing kneecap's grant, the then business secretary acted unlawfully in taking into account the constitutional aspirations expressed by the members of kneecap, which had no bearing on the matter at hand. Mrs. Badenoch's actions were all the more striking because we can well imagine a universe in which she grounded her decision not on kneecap's position on the constitutional question, but on the general impropriety of their music and public personas. It was in this sense an unforced error. So think of, for example, their frequent references to drug use. Such a decision, grounded on those reasons, may well have been somewhat censorious, it may have been somewhat po-faced, but I suggest that it would have been legal, or it would be arguably legal, having breached no constitutional principle. I therefore let out a great cry of anguish when the current government settled the case, depriving us of grist for our mill. So the claim I'm making for parity of esteem's place as a constitutional principle in the legal constitution is a relatively thin one, an interpretive principle of both symbolic and legal importance guiding decision makers. In terms of the political constitution, the argument for taking parity of esteem seriously as a constitutional principle is perhaps easier, And I'd like to segue here to the second argument I'd like to make, that both the British and Irish constitutional orders have not internalised the concept. So if we take Professor McCrudden's admirably succinct definition of the political constitution as the set of conventions, practices and values that underlie the political system but may not be reflected in legal arrangements, and then let's keep that in mind and recall the Constitution Unit statement: the constitutional principles provide a framework within which politics is properly conducted. I'd like to take you back to illustrate the point to an exchange on the floor of the House of Commons between David Cameron and Ed Miliband just over 10 years ago in March 2015, which, given everything that has happened since, feels like about 100 years ago. So Mr. Miliband impugned Mr. Cameron's character for, I quote, chickening out of television debates in advance of the general election with, quote, feeble excuses. In response, Mr. Cameron said, "I shall tell the honourable gentleman what goes to character. Someone who's prepared to crawl into Downing Street in alliance with people who want to break up our country. What a despicable and weak thing to do." Mr. Cameron obviously enjoyed the line about crawling into Downing Street because this was the third of 4 times in which he used it during this exchange. Now, such language might be regarded as an impolite way to speak to one's opponent. It might be regarded as an impolite way to disparage those who desire independence for Scotland. Or it could simply be regarded as a robust but entirely permissible part of parliamentary rough and tumble, part and parcel of constitutional politics in a mature democracy. Politically, it may be wise, rallying support behind the Conservative Unionist cause, or it may be unwise, alienating voters who might otherwise be persuadable. But in the context of the Anglo-Scottish Union of 1707, it is perfectly constitutional. It breaches no principle of the political constitution because parity of esteem is emphatically not part of the political constitution of the United Kingdom as a whole, or of Scotland, or of England, or of Wales, or of their interrelationships. It's a concept I argue specifically to be part of the political constitution of Northern Ireland and of the United Kingdom, specifically in respect of Northern Ireland. This being the case, let us imagine for a moment that the situation had been different, and that it had looked possible in 2015 that Mr. Miliband might ascend to the Prime Ministry as a latter-day Gladstone, reliant on the votes of, say, the SDLP. I think a prima facie argument can at least be made that it would have been unconstitutional, in the Ivor Jennings sense of being politically improper, for Mr. Cameron to speak of the SDLP's constitutional aspirations in this disparaging manner. Now, I have to be careful here. Parity of esteem as a principle is not so strong that it outweighs, for example, the right of an MP to speak freely on the floor of the House of Commons. But I'm not saying that the imagined circumstances of a prospective Labour government propped up by the SDLP, it would have been illegal for Mr. Cameron to speak disparagingly of Irish nationalism. I'm merely saying it would have been improper in a way that it was not improper of him, so to speak, of Scottish nationalism. And let us bear in mind, too, that here Mr. Cameron, though he was speaking from the government benches, from the dispatch box, he was really speaking in his capacity as leader of the Conservative Party about forthcoming television debates, and he was not exercising a governmental function at the time. So there are differences. If he had been, it is arguable that the political obligation of impartiality as between unionism and nationalism in government action would have weighed more strongly. And I think we can have a discussion about what that obligation works out to in real life. Before leaving this point, we can stretch our imaginations further. We can imagine an exchange on the floor of Dáil Éireann in 2045, or 2095, or 2145. Where an outgoing Taoiseach, if he or she is still called Taoiseach by that point, berates the leader of the opposition for scheming to, quote, crawl into government buildings in alliance with people who want to break up our country, referring this time to Ulster Unionists, or Irish Unionists. That too, I argue, would be unconstitutional, at least politically, and depending on the legal shape of a future all-Irish constitution, and with all the caveats I mentioned earlier about the freedom to speak in Parliament, quite possibly legally too. So as I said, the Cameron-Miliband exchange illustrates, I think, the second point that I'm making here about, for all the ubiquity of the concept of parity of esteem in the 1990s and its important place in the agreement, neither the British nor the Irish states seem to have internalised the concept. As regards the Irish state, this is, if we're being somewhat generous, understandable, at least in the current constitutional context. The agreement is clear that the obligation on the Irish government to govern with rigorous impartiality and with due regard for parity of esteem is a contingent obligation obligation that would kick in only in the event of unification. Now, as we know, the agreement is phrased specifically to allow for its principles to continue in operation in a united Ireland. So just as Parity of Esteem renders illegitimate any attempt by the British state to treat Irish nationalists in Northern Ireland as wreckers or as an enemy within, so too would it prohibit a future Irish state, its government, its judiciary, its other actors, and arguably its citizenry, from treating unionism as treachery. Now, problematically, Ireland as it is currently constituted is only partially and only very slightly geared toward the kind of consociational politics gestured at by the concept of parity of esteem. Article 3 of the Constitution, after its amendment, states that it's the firm will of the Irish nation in harmony and friendship to unite all of the people who share the territory of the island of Ireland in all the diversity of their identities and traditions. Now, this provision is phrased in exactly the kind of inclusive language used by the Good Friday Agreement, though it's perhaps worth noting in this context that the reference to diversity of identities and traditions does not explicitly include a reference to diversity of constitutional aspirations. Article 3, therefore, sits uneasily alongside Article 9.3, which has been part of the Constitution since its enactment in 1937, which states that fidelity to the nation and loyalty to the state are fundamental political duties of all citizens. Now, the Constitution does distinguish quite clearly between the nation and the state. These are two separate things in Ireland. It is not at all clear what can be read, if anything, into the distinction between fidelity to the nation on the one hand and loyalty to the state on the other. I don't know if and how these two ideas differ. More importantly, it's difficult, though not impossible, to see how these fundamental political duties could be brought into harmony with parity of esteem in a united Ireland. Let us assume that a united Ireland kept legally intact, as it should, the government's obligations to use its powers consistently with parity of esteem for the aspirations of the unionist community. Would a desire to unify Ireland, or a part of Ireland, or for that matter all of Ireland, with Great Britain be consistent with fidelity to the nation? Maybe, depending on how one thinks about it. Would it be consistent with loyalty to the state? Perhaps a taller order, but you could construct such an argument. But it's difficult, and clearly all of this and more would need to be the subject of intense study and debate in the event of unification, and sterling work has already been done in this regard by many, including many in this room. But that is all work for the future and maybe for never. I believe it to be an open question as to how prepared the Irish state and southern society are to not merely tolerate, but to affirmatively respect and esteem, and in Richard's words from earlier this morning, admire the continued articulation of unionist political expression in the event of Irish unification. It cannot be that the British minority in a united Ireland, or the British or British-Irish component of the broader Irish nation, is suspected of trying to burn the house down, to borrow the late David Trimble's phrase. And parity of esteem would need to be consciously embedded as a specific and legally binding constitutional norm in any new constitution. So this brings me then to my idea of aspirational pluralism, and I'd just like to explain how I came to be interested in the idea of parity of esteem in the first place. This is also where my written notes run out and I start freestyling. Much of my work to date has related to the idea of constitutional pluralism as a way of thinking about the relationship between the legal order of the European Union and the legal orders, the constitutional orders of its member states. In a nutshell, constitutional pluralism argues that we should not regard these legal orders as being arranged in some hierarchy, vertically integrated, with EU law on top if that's what you want, or with national law ultimately on top if that's what you want. Instead, constitutional pluralism conceives of these relationships as being relational, as being arranged in a conceptual heterarchy, where the answer as to which norm should prevail in any given circumstance is far more contingent than either the Court of Justice or some national courts would have you believe. Now, this has always attracted me because I cordially dislike the concept of hierarchy, possibly because I hate being told what to do, and I also hate telling other people what to do, which is perhaps odd for a constitutional lawyer. In an article in which I was defending the concept of constitutional pluralism from those who claim that it leads ultimately to the destruction of the European Union because it causes legal uncertainty, it undermines the primacy of EU law, I analogized the role of constitutional pluralist scholars and their rejection of the absolute primacy of EU law as articulated by the Court of Justice to the idea of the loyal opposition. And I said, look, just because we reject the Court of Justice orthodoxy, that does not make us wreckers. That does not mean that we are responsible for Viktor Orbán and all the rest. These ideas can be misused, yes, but a knife can be used to chop onions and a knife can be used to cause serious harm as well. All ideas are dangerous. So I start with my general rejection of hierarchy. I then got interested in the idea of the development of the political idea of loyal opposition, that just because you are voicing opposition to those in government, that is not a rejection of the state itself. And so then I thought about, I don't know how it came to me, but the idea of parity of esteem in that context. So the state has its own conception of the good, and the state's own conception of the good usually, almost always, involves its own permanent continuation. States don't contemplate their own demise generally. They don't contemplate lopping off their own limbs. And yet we have a state here, the United Kingdom, and we have a state down below, both of which are obliged to each other by their signatures to valorize secessionism. Can we then think of a kind of constitutional law that is aspirationally pluralist, that does not regard loyalty to the maintenance of the continued state order as a sine qua non of constitutional action? Could it be that the current United Kingdom or a future Irish Republic could regard the desire for an independent all-Irish Republic or the desire for a British Union incorporating at least Northern Ireland as being arranged heterarchically rather than hierarchically? And the precise preference that one expresses for one over the other is not the role of the state. It is specifically the role of individuals and communities, and the state's role then is relegated to being that of a neutral arbiter. And with that question, I will say thank you very much.
Great. Thank you all. It's lovely to be in Belfast again on such a typically sunny and hot day. I'm conscious about coming to Belfast and talking to Parity of Esteem is a bit like bringing your proverbial colds to Newcastle. And I very much include myself in that sort of other foreigner relationship, being from a part of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, which hasn't even begun to start getting its head vaguely around the concept of parity of esteem, as Tom indicated. I'll come back to that. But what I want to do is to pick up elements of Tom's talk and elements of what we've been discussing today, and to circumvent the fact that there's so many experts in this room. I'm going to go on a bit of a global tour and only come back to Ireland, North and South, at the end of my global tour. I should say, by the way, for those of you who heard the initial draft of this paper in Essex, it's been heavily revised, not least because Chris gave us sight of his keynote 2 days ago, which is extremely helpful for ripping up much of what I was going to say and rewriting a lot more. So if this sounds slightly provisional, just bear with me. Parity of esteem, as Chris and others have outlined, is probably best described, frankly, as an underlapping consensus, recognizing the legitimacy of different constitutional aspirations as embedded in communal culture and political expression. It's linked to the idea, as Chris indicated, that there are sort of constituent peoples with different traditions within a single constitutional political space, whose different constitutional orientations should be, if you want, respected by overarching governance. This is the sort of aspiration behind parity of esteem, couched at a sort of macro level. As numerous commentators have indicated, it sort of contains strong echoes of Charles Taylor's theorizing about recognition, the need to recognize different political, cultural traditions within a state, developed in the specific context of Canadian politics and the reaction to Quebec secessionism in the 1990s, but also developed, and I'm going to come back to this, in the context of the triumph of liberalism and the end of history in the 1990s. And I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to insert there as a rather ominous placeholder and come back to that. But in noting this concept of parity of esteem, it is, I think, important to note that it's quite a radical notion which conflicts with an older constitutional tradition, which is deeply embedded in probably the majority of constitutions around the world, and which in some ways is radically conflicts with the idea of parity of esteem. This is the constitutional tradition that pretty much sees constitutional form as involving a populace defined by history, territory, tradition, coming together within a common constitutional framework, a particular specified democratic constitutional ordering, and once you're in that ordering, you have a common destiny, whether you like it or not. You're all committed to this common ordering. You're supposed to all collectively respect the common ground rules that you're all signed up to, whether you like it or not. This older constitutional tradition is often analysed as a right-wing construct, with, for example, right-wing constitutional theorists like Carl Schmitt often being invoked to explain this constitutional tradition. I'm going to slightly complicate things by pointing out that its origins are probably rather not right-wing at all. And I'm going to describe this constitutional tradition as the Jacobean constitutional tradition, because it has its origins in the French Revolution. This idea first developed by Robespierre and others that, right, we have this morass of the French people with all their different constitutional traditions and regions, and we're going to smush them together into a common republican constitutional framework where everyone is formally equal, everyone is bound by the same rules of the game, everyone plays the same rules of the game, and if you, the Vendée or the Languedoc or whatever, want to leave and go back to your medieval superstitions and ancien regime, then we will sort you out and force you to comply with the republican order. Okay? Now, that's a rather dramatic articulation of this older constitutional tradition, and you might go, well, that's very old-fashioned. He's just quoted Robespierre, he's quoted Carl Schmitt. You know, these are all, dubious characters. But it's important to remember that this Jacobean constitutional tradition, which requires fidelity to the requires and expects constitutional fidelity to the established rules of the game, is very much alive in many, many European states. Now, we've heard discussion of the complicated case of Spain from Mikel, and we'll have more discussion about Spain. But it's worthwhile pointing out that the attitude of France to Corsican separatists doesn't take the form of political and legal acknowledgement of the legitimacy of their aspirations. It usually takes the form of, well, we might grant you, as Macron indicated recently, a special provision in the Constitution saying that some extra local government might be nice for you. But that's it, because that's all that the French constitutional tradition can recognize. And in case you think that's the French being old-fashioned, just think about the Baltic states, where, the aspirations of the Russian minority in those states to radically reconfigure the constitutional form of those states is not recognized as being a legitimate alternative mode of constitutional ordering. Just think about the wider global south, where alternative constitutional forms of ordering are again usually conceptualized as not acceptable in a political and legal sense because they're seen as undermining national self-determination. So, your constitutional preference for Biafra to be an independent state in the early 1970s, or Katanga to be an independent state in the early 1960s, was not respected at all, let alone be granted parity of esteem. Okay? And that's a position that many global south constitutional cultures will articulate and defend quite strongly. My colleague Barhoun Gabay, writing in his analysis of African constitutionalism, points out that this is a very dominant feature of African constitutionalism in democratic states as well as non-democratic states. So this Jacobean constitutional tradition, demanding, requiring, expecting constitutional conformity, is very much alive both in Europe and on a global basis. It's a tradition that often triggers allergic reactions from liberals, human rights fans, the type of people overrepresented in this room. Okay? But it is very much an alive tradition. It's a tradition that's deeply embedded in constitutional form. Okay? It's a tradition that's often invoked by those self-same liberals and human rights fans when certain modes of constitutional ordering suddenly start entering the picture. I'll give you a very concrete example of that. The current selection of judges to the German Constitutional Court, as fed through the Bundestag, excludes the AfD. The Alternative for Deutschland doesn't really get to have its preferences for potential judicial nominees onto the German Constitutional Court reflected in votes for that court. And you know, its composition is periodically renewed over time by a Bundestag selection of candidates. Why is that? Because politically speaking, the AfD's constitutional aspirations are not given parity of esteem. In fact, as you may know, there's a debate in Germany about whether the AfD should be banned on the basis it fails to conform to the fundamental constitutional values of the German Federal Republic. Okay? Not that much parity of esteem there. And you find as you start poking around in other aspects, if you want to say the constitution of the UK and Ireland should be based on the 12th century caliphate, okay, you will need to pay close attention to recent jurisprudence on the scope of counterterrorism powers, okay, by way of an example. In the United States, if you want to say, well, until very recently, I should say, if you want to say that I actually quite like the Confederacy as an alternative mode of constitutional thing, then your statues will be torn down and the salt, until very recently, and the ground will be salted from under you, okay? No parity of esteem there. Now, of course, they're all completely different contexts from Northern Ireland. But the general point I want to make is that the Jacobean Republican constitutional tradition requiring, expecting conformity to the established rules of the game is actually very strong. And you start poking around different constitutional systems, even in our own quite liberal, relatively liberal systems, and you see it lurking there. Sometimes at the margins, sometimes only targeting extremist groups, etc., but it sort of lurks there. And it's important to note that not alone is the Jacobean concept very embedded, it also can be quite difficult to escape in the sense of states need to commit themselves to a particular form of ordering. States have symbols, their flags. They have particular modes of handling constitutional disputes. They require politics to be conducted in a particular way. You see that in Spain with the divisions over the Catalan call for independence in 2017. You see it in the debates about Scotland. You know, a unilateral declaration of independence by Holyrood is unlikely to be greeted with London with, okay, fair enough, that's your alternative constitutional take on how the UK Constitution involves, let's have a chat about. Now, that might be part of the reaction, but the formal position from the UK government is that that will be an unlawful constitutional call that you've made, and we're not going to respect your particular call. Again, extreme situation, I know. You can quibble whether it fits very well what we're talking about today, but I'm just illustrating that states, in a way, almost to function, have to commit themselves to the Jacobean model at a certain basic level. They define their territory, they define their people, they define who gets to vote. There's always a certain amount of constitutional ordering. It involves a pre-commitment to constitutional rules and a sort of set of requirements that you respect those constitutional rules. And yet, as we all know, states always have to grapple with dissenting constitutional views, often linked to particular cultural or political blocs. And again, once you start looking around the world and broadening your horizons a little bit, you actually see how even constitutions that very much come trademarked with the "we are a Jacobean constitution," and not the sort of Canadian, Northern Ireland fluff about, you can all be accommodated, we'll all recognise your parity. Even the constitutions that come with a branded, "we are strong, everyone has to abide by the constitutional rules," if you actually look very often, those constitutions are in the business of accommodating quite diverse and conflicting constitutional visions. One interesting, the example I always throw out is Italy, where the entire very successful post-war Italian constitutional ordering was the need to find some way of getting the communists, the socialists, and the Christian Democrats to live together. So the entire Italian constitutional order, in effect, in its practical political operation, not legally, operated on the basis of actually recognizing a sort of parity of esteem to radically different political, constitutional, ethical visions. So you may know practically, for example, in the old days before the Taglan-Topley political scandals in the 1990s, RAA1, the first state channel, was given to the Christian Democrats. RAA2 was given to the socialists. RAA3 was given to the communists. Everyone knew that was the rules of the game. That's how parity of esteem, in the Italian sense, was negotiated in a constitution. If you read the 48 Italian constitution, very much committed to the Jacobean model. So even Jacobean constitutions, self-proclaimed, proud Jacobean constitutions, have to deal with the reality of, often have to deal with the reality of dealing with conflicting constitutional visions. And again, you start poking around, you see these difficulties all the time. Currently, as some of you know, I reside in Brussels. There is no Brussels government at the moment, almost a year after the last election. There is no prospect of a Brussels government being formed. The Belgians see the Northern Irish practices in not having a government and sort of multiply that by 10, right? And as far as I can work out, as a short-term resident there, government in Belgium is seen as a very optional add-on, if you want. But interestingly, one of the reasons the Brussels government hasn't been formed is that the Francophonie clear 70% majority of parties don't see the need why they should accommodate the Flemish nationalists, who are very, very small, only 4% support in Brussels. They don't see the need why they should accommodate Flemish nationalists who are ultimately committed to the breakup of the Belgian state. You're saying, well, we don't have to accommodate these people in our governance arrangements, even though it involves breaking with convention. Because they're saying, well, actually, we don't respect your alternative constitutional vision. You want to break up the state, we're not accommodating you. Okay? I'm the first person to compare the Belgian socialists to Kemi Badenoch, but there's a similar logic there. We don't have to play games with you if you're committed to this. So you see this sort of tricky relationship between the sort of Jacobean Republican form of constitutionalism, which is in many ways the old form, the original form of modern constitutionalism, coming into tension with the need to accommodate sometimes quite radical political, ethical, constitutional visions. And this brings me right back to Northern Ireland and Ireland in the brief time available to me. The value of concepts of parity of esteem, it seems to me, is that they provide a way of framing that irritation that can exist between constitutional form and the reality that's on ground. They offer a way of sort of framing disagreement and tension and awkwardness. And they provide a way of talking about these tensions. So Chris in his keynote said, look, parity of esteem, very little content, sets up unfulfillable expectations, tries to indulge in a bit of creative ambiguity, but there's a real question about whether it's being creative or whether it's just being destructive. My own view is that concepts like parity of esteem as it operates in Northern Ireland are actually quite a useful way of channeling the sort of framing debates that would be happening anyway, and providing us with quite a useful way of arguing, quite a useful way of structuring argument and having a discussion about Irish language, signs, and Grand Central Station, and so on, that actually, in a way, mightn't be the worst way of having those arguments. So I take Chris's point completely. This doesn't act as a bridge, but it may very well act as quite a useful, not quite a bridge, quite a useful way of structuring and channeling conflict into particular forms of words, particular commitments. And that's where I think perhaps the concept of parity of esteem has sort of wider comparative value, precisely because it offers a way, in all its vagueness, in all its potential normative emptiness, it still opens a way of, it still has the potential to frame things in interesting ways, to force participants to sort of think through some of their commitments. Now, this brings me in my final minute where I promised to finish, which is the Republic of Ireland down south. It's interesting, in support of my position, the fact that the Republic of Ireland, political elites, media elites, people on the ground, have never really engaged with the concept of parity of esteem in any meaningful way. I'm allowed to say this, I'm from Cork. We don't get parity of esteem down south, no one else gets it. There's never really been serious engagement there. There's never really been a thinking through of if Ireland were to suddenly end up being the sovereign power in Northern Ireland, if Dublin were to end up being the sovereign power in Northern Ireland through some process in the morning and the Good Friday Agreement provisions suddenly kick in, any reasonable set of Dublin politicians would be left there gaping like fish. Okay? No disrespect to them, it's true. And partially what we've seen is that we haven't thought through the irritating impact. There hasn't been real engagement. There hasn't been enough of a discussion about parity of esteem for people in the Republic to get irritated, to have to think seriously about what awkward compromises, awkward institutional arrangements, awkward commemorations to shift, or new forms of state recognition. They haven't had to think about the tensions, the irritation, as Devani put it earlier, of accommodating the alternative tradition, so to speak, in Northern Ireland. And that's a sure sign they haven't really got to grips with parity of esteem, because they haven't experienced it yet as being irritating. And that, I think, for me, is the value, the true value of parity of esteem nowadays, is that it actually forces irritation, it forces you to reconsider, it makes you think about how much your Jacobean constitutional tradition, the Republican constitutional tradition is quite Jacobean, how much that needs to change. And that's where I'll conclude on Chris's. I didn't disagree with a single word of Chris's keynote, which was fantastic, but I was left thinking, yes, you said it's not a bridge, but I'm also left thinking, well, but things can be negative and irritating and provocative and challenging and can still be really useful. And that, I think, is perhaps the role of parity of esteem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. On the grounds that things can be irritating but useful, I might make a comment in response to both of your papers before opening up to questions. That is to say, perhaps in all of this, we are imagining that the Good Friday Belfast Agreement is far more radical and imaginative than it actually is. So perhaps a different reading of it is that even the principle of parity of esteem itself is to cement the foundation, which is the British-Irish relationship. And fundamentally, what we're talking about is the recognition of the British government, of the Irish government and state, and vice versa. And in many ways, I think we could be seen as being wrong to try and disaggregate identity, ethos, and aspirations. And as I teach my students, those are put there for absolute deliberate purpose together, because it's meant to allow both states to be acting on the part of one community or another. So that is a national identity, like Irish Catholic nationalist, British Protestant unionist, overriding all the fact that they do not exist per se as homogenous blocks. Of course they don't. So the interpretation that the Good Friday Agreement is founded on is majoritarianism, because you have to allow the idea of one majority over another to allow for self-determination. Okay, which then means that we are not talking about pluralism. Actually, it is simple majoritarianism. And then the second point is rigorous impartiality is with respect to the exercise of sovereign power. And again, that is not about, that could be seen as very much about the Irish state being reassured by the British government that in its exercise of sovereign power in Northern Ireland, it will be respecting the identity, ethos and aspirations of its kin community, and vice versa with respect to unification and a united Irish state. So it's not about cessation, so it's about unification, which is an important difference, I think, that is fundamentally about the two governments' respect for each other. And perhaps that explains why it is that in the expansion and intensification of notions of parity of esteem, including towards principle of consent, etc., that has very much been seen in tandem with a breakdown of that respect as we might see it, or that esteem as we might have understood it between the two governments. So I'll just throw that for you to respond.
Well, I agree with a lot of that, yes. Right. No, I'll think about it a bit more.
I mean, one thing I'd like to add to it, and I also agree, is that so you have this document, painstakingly reached, every word in there for a reason, subject of negotiation, designed by committee, and so therefore displeasing in many respects. But so much of it depends and depended on personalities. So I was reading recently about the relationship between John Major and Albert Reynolds, and how so much of it was down to the fact that they were kind of similar people, kind of an image of like the grey man. They had both previously been finance ministers, and so had known each other in that context in the European Council, and this had allowed a kind of rapport to build up that hadn't existed between, Charlie Haughey and Margaret Thatcher, and how that persisted then until probably 2015-16, and then things hit the skids in a very serious way. And so then you wonder, well, if the essence of the agreement is not within the North, if it's East-West, then that's something that needs to be continually kind of nurtured in a way that I don't think either sovereign government has showered themselves in glory in the past 10 years.
Questions? Chris?
So I hadn't intended to start on this, but if I could do a comment on the comment, which is that I think the way you've expressed is very interesting, because it basically goes back to John Gregg and Blakely, right? And that sort of reaches its apex in the Anglo-Irish Agreement, where it's basically the two governments getting together and doing a deal to respect each other. Fine, I get that. And that's really important. But it's not what the Good Friday Agreement was supposed to be about, at least as perceived by the multi-party element of the agreement. It just wasn't that. It was also an internal Northern Ireland issue. And increasingly it became, the parity of esteem was seen as being primarily with regard to relations within Northern Ireland. And so I take your point that that could have been and may revert to be the essence of it, but that would be to, we shouldn't rewrite history that that's what it was all about in the first place. I don't think it was. But anyway, we can come back to that perhaps separately. But the point I wanted to make was, or the issue I wanted to raise really was, everybody, since my talk earlier on through the day has mentioned the word identity, but we haven't actually thought about it very much. And indeed, Tom, you said, I'm not going to talk about that stuff. I'm going to talk about the other bits in the trinity of ethos, whatever, and whatever, including identity, yeah? But I think it's important, and particularly in the context of Colum's, if I may say, excellent and very interesting talk, to come back to this question about identity. For this reason, that I quite take your point, Colum, that one of the functions that it might have, parity of esteem, is to be an irritant that sort of at least brings to get people together, not as a bridge, but as getting people in the same room together, at least to talk. And that, I mean, there are 2 points to make about that. One is, I don't think that's actually happening. I mean, simply as an empirical point at the moment. I mean, look at the language issues. It's taken an enormous amount of time to get even an act. And again, I'm not commenting whether that's good or bad. It's just factual. And it hasn't even been brought into operation yet in major parts. So I just don't think empirically that's what's happening. But that isn't the real issue that I want to raise. The real issue is whether, when parity of esteem is linked to identity, whether it's even capable of being that, for the following reason. We can have political aspirations, and we all have political aspirations, but for that to be translated into identity is a step that we shouldn't ignore. Because when somebody is conceiving of themselves as fundamentally as identity assumes, as being committed to a particular political position, it makes compromise almost impossible. Because it's very much different, conservatives and liberals and Labour are sitting down and talking about, whether there should be a planned economy or not. That, however much, they may think it is, that's not about identity, and they don't define it as such. That's about political compromise and the politics of the situation. In Northern Ireland, God bless us, to define this stuff as identity then gets us into identity politics. And identity politics, and I'm not going to do all kind of woke stuff and, talk Kemi Badenoch stuff. I'm not as skeptical of identity politics as all of that, but it does raise an issue about whether compromise is possible when you identify it as identity. And so if you're talking about a parity of esteem of identities, rather than just aspirations, which was the way you put it, Tom, that I think raises the game enormously in terms of the potential difficulty of actually reaching any agreement.
Colum?
Yeah, Chris, that's really interesting. I'm not sure you can separate out identity and constitutional aspirations. I'm not sure you can do it here. Living in Belgium, you definitely can, because they speak different languages, for example. So the politicians will speak a different language to articulate their different constitutional aspirations. So I think in a way your constitutional aspirations are bundled up with identity, and you might want to de-emphasize that link as far as possible. But I think it's very, very difficult to separate them out. And parity of esteem mightn't be working very well to bring people together, but that one mightn't be working at all to bring people together or to force people to think through what living together means with different aspirations and identities. But it doesn't have to do all the work of unifying and bridge building and so on. There are lots of other concepts floating around that'll do that. For me, the advantage of parity of esteem is that it slightly sets up a boxing ring, not to put too fine a point in it. And it basically says, you go and discuss what parity of esteem means. And I'm influenced by this slightly by my residence in Belgium. I usually only get the Francophone take on this. But actually, there's interesting lessons there about parity of esteem in terms of how you recognize quite different constitutional visions in terms of your messaging, your organization of government, and various things like that. And the two communities do not get on in Belgium. They intensely dislike each other. But something which could be vaguely analogous to parity of esteem does exist in government formation and composition of the Constitutional Court, all this stuff. And for me, it does slightly function like a boxing ring and sets the rules of the boxing game. So it's still conflictual, but at least you have a structured concept or common values in play. Now, these are vague ideas, I know, but I'm just putting it there just to maybe complicate the conversation.
Do you want to respond, Tom?
Yeah, if I could. I didn't want in my talk to gloss over the question of identity, which I agree with Colin that identity and aspiration are very intimately linked in this context. I did want to gloss over the concept of ethos, in that I don't know or understand what the word ethos is doing, what work it's performing in there. I think then the question is it, in some sense, is it institutionalizing sectarian to link so closely identity and constitutional aspiration? Is it possible to have an identity that is proudly Irish, all the rest of it, and yet also aspiring to maintain the union? I would say yes. There's lots of probably quite quiet people who feel that way. I think what I was getting at, though, is that at least for present purposes, you can use identity, you can use it heuristically to think, well, we know what that means. It means us'ns and them's, right? And yes, also then the others, but we don't talk about them. So in a way that you can bookend it and then focus on the aspiration point. Think about what parity of esteem means in terms of state responsibilities as regard aspirations, and then once you have a clearer idea of what that means, then reintroduce identity into the problem. And then, you need to expand the problem to include not just us'ns and them's, but the others, the groups who consider themselves neither recent or less recent migrant arrivals and so forth. Does that explain my approach? I should point out as well, I did get told by a Belgian friend of mine several years ago that there was a scandal at one point that because the king's dogs only spoke French, and so they had to specifically train the dogs to respond to commands in Flemish as well. So, I think that's an example of parity of esteem in action as well.
Thank you. We have a question from Leah. No, sorry, Christian. No, Leah here. Sorry, just in the, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you both. Very interesting. My question is for Colin. See, when I think about parity of esteem from my particular perspective, no spoilers, you'll hear about those tomorrow. I think, so your talk has given me a way of reframing this. Basically, you have choices, constitutionally speaking. If you have different aspirations within one state, you can either demand loyalty, risk violence, or you can have something like parity of esteem. And it seems to me the avoidance of violence, the avoidance of escalation is a really, really important part of parity of esteem. I think it may be one of the reasons why it can or should exist as a principle. So I would perhaps both ask you what you think of this framing, and maybe also encourage you to sort of even sharpen your point and say, well, you can either have ways of resolving conflict, including about identity and ethos, in dialogue, even if that's really uncomfortable and takes a really long time, or you risk violence. I don't believe I have to explain this here, right? So it may even be like there might even be more to that point than what you just said. That's what I'm wondering. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that. I suppose the objection might be, well, parity of esteem isn't stopping violence. But I have to say, if you define violence very, very broadly, and again, I keep on coming back to Belgium. I mean, no one in Belgium is going to kill anyone. But the state, as of 10 years ago, was on its deathbed. And there was quite a lot of aggression and nastiness, which still exists to this day, somewhat diluted. And part of what they've, and I'm still getting my head around this, I'm trying to read a bit about it, but part of what they've achieved is to slightly find ways of making the gestures towards the radically different constitutional visions in both parts. So if you define violence very broadly, as including constitutional violence, there may be times when that sort of like symbolic structuring of conflict and symbolic structuring of disagreement may be actually very, very important for holding stuff together, put it that way, putting it in broad terms. So yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. Very good point.
Thank you. Colin, and then gentleman at the back, and then Ewan. Just here, sorry, in the fancy jacket.
Thank you. No, thanks for two great papers. I'm going to try for a question that maybe both of you could come in on. Is a lot of the issue here in trying to particularize parity of esteem around NI, as opposed to really thinking about this in terms of the discourse around the UK as a constitutional order? And I get, Tom, you've dealt with this head on, and would parity of esteem apply to Scottish nationalism in the same way, and you're saying it wouldn't. But is that mostly a problem of how London sees the constitutional order, as opposed to that being the only discourse of the constitutional order? So do we define the UK as a union state, or a unitary state, or a unified state, or a state with one central unifying principle in parliamentary sovereignty, even if that's not always used? What is the core of this? And you ask different actors at different points in the constitutional order, and you will get very different answers to that question. If you go back over 100 years to the Home Rule League, the Latin motto of the League was "Iunga non ligata." We're joined, we're not tied. And there has always been a contrary discourse within a multi-polity state drawn together, not a typical nation state, that you cannot have, or you cannot alone have that discourse of no dissolution, the centre rules this, a muscular unionism writ large. And is the problem here is what parity of esteem is trying to do is set up a counter narrative, even if it is a minor narrative in the context of the constituent elements of the UK being radically different sizes and having radically different power within that. But to take Colum's idea of an irritant here, is the value here not being able to say, well, the constituent parts need to have a voice within that union for that union to work, as opposed to it just being a central and unified constitutional order, a nation state. And what's different here is a difference from a nation state.
I think that parity of esteem, or a notion analogous to it, I mean, could become part of the institutional setup, the political and legal constitution in other parts of the UK. It just hasn't, right? I mean, there is no Good Friday Agreement in relation to Scotland, and thankfully so, because, I mean, that came out of a conflict, and for all the occasionally harsh words during the 2014 period, I mean, very thankfully, I think a skillful job was done by both sides in making sure that things didn't go that way. But I think it's interesting what you said about the inherent lopsidedness of the UK, and I mean the question there is the English question, and I think, I mean, and that's just a consequence of the economic, geographic, demographic predominance of England within the United Kingdom, and so from that perspective, then, I mean, even the nature of the UK as a union state is itself an irritant. I mean, it would be far easier for the majority of the UK simply to ditch all this discourse of union state and so forth and say, look, this is just Britain, which is England. I mean, going back to the command before Trafalgar, England expects each man to do his duty, not the United Kingdom. So I think these things are an irritant to the English political imagination. I think it is in many respects a salutary irritant because it is important that those in power in London bear in mind the plural nature of the state. But I don't think that in things as they are currently playing out on the island of Great Britain, I don't think there's any need or point in an idea of parity of esteem in terms of constitutional aspirations. Plus, it would be politically very difficult as well. Just thinking in terms of English republicanism, I mean, you know, people being locked up during the coronation period for holding up bank signs and so forth. I don't want to overstate the case here, but it's just that the political culture there, we mentioned the red tops earlier on. I mean, it doesn't even like plurality, let alone pluralism. And I think that, I mean, injecting an idea of parity of esteem into politics in Great Britain, I think in theory might be a nice idea, but just incredibly difficult and would only be done as it was done in this part of the world for a specific reason, because of a very difficult history that was trying to be escaped from.
I'm still thinking through all of this in live time, so I'm not quite sure whether any of these sentences will actually end or make any sense. It's very exciting. I sometimes, as some of you will know, get invited to right-wing think tank events in London as a sort of, get Cullum, he'll defend the ECHR and other dubious stuff. Invite him along and see what he comes up with. It's absolutely fascinating talking to the muscular unionists because they think they have been absolute suckers to have conceded the Jacobean constitution. Absolute Cameron is despised because they think he got suckered into a basic error in 2014 or beforehand in recognising that Scotland could detach itself without a general UK final say on any separation agreement and everything else. And there is a sense in those muscular unionist circles that the UK seems to have talked itself into a position where it is the least Jacobean constitution in all of Europe, that it agrees to positions that the French would just simply think was just outrageous. So you get this intellectual challenge sometimes, that, we get portrayed as being sort of backwards, non-liberal and so on. But, the UK is actually very non-Jacobean. And it's time to change that. And that's what Badenoch was signalling with her comments about kneecap, which I think might have been more to do with signalling within the Conservative Party with vis-a-vis longer-term debates about Scotland than anything specific to kneecap, as charming as they may be. But I think that's a rather interesting intellectual challenge in a way. It's not often framed in academic terms, but it's a rather interesting intellectual challenge. And this is, and getting back to parity of esteem, I do think there's something there to say there's more going on here than simply respecting individual rights to disagree. That there is something about recognising that there are different constitutional traditions, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and so on, that should be respected and given some form of institutional expression. And that the concept of parity of esteem in the negative sense, in a way that I'm using it, to talk about an irritation maybe, is doing some work there that other concepts aren't doing as a response to that muscular unionist challenge. And I'm still thinking this through, but I think the concept is potentially capable of doing some work there in Britain, as it has in Northern Ireland, and that does... And there are other concepts don't quite fill that gap, which I'm still struggling to articulate.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back.
I just want to say, in a divided society, you have a disparity of esteem, and therefore parity of esteem is essential to bring about peace and a peace process. So it acts as a kind of it's a conduit for, I suppose, an understanding of the values that we have and what we want, the values that we want to live by in society. I just want any response to that.
I think you're right in many respects, but it seems to me that we already have a vocabulary to talk about the kind of respect, the kind of dignity, the kind of lack of discrimination you're talking about. It's this magic phrase, parity of esteem, presumably has to mean something slightly different than merely equality or merely respect or merely dignity, all of which are, of course, important as well. And I think, and because the addressee, the primary addressee of the idea of parity of esteem isn't you and me and the ordinary person on the street. It's not saying to us, you must respect your opponent. It's specifically aiming it at the state. And it's saying to the state, look, you cannot treat this one as being better, more morally praiseworthy than the other one, which is strange for the state because the state does that all the time. The state treats those without criminal records as being more morally praiseworthy than old jailbird lags. So I think that, yes, it is an essential concept. It's an important concept. It's a hard discussed, hard fought for concept. But it's a concept that needs thinking through, just as other concepts such as non-discrimination, equality, dignity, these all need thinking through as well. But because it is a special magic phrase, I think it just has to mean something different, something that goes beyond or supplements or works with those other ideas of non-discrimination, equality, and so forth.
About shared values, I'm beginning to think that, in my own head, the parity of esteem may actually reflect the fact that we disagree. And Alan Finlayson, who some of you may know, writing back in the 1990s, one paper he wrote on this, he called Parity of Esteem, Parity of Contempt, which I quite liked as a one-liner. But actually, there may be something there that we recognize that we have very significant issues with each other, but we're stuck in a relatively small space, and we have to live with each other, and we need to communally disagree about important stuff and not just tolerate individual dissent. And so I wonder, is it more than shared values? Is it actually trying to say something about living together with disagreement? But again, this is all lifetime thinking and maybe...
We agreed to disagree. Yeah.
Thank you. Ewan has a question. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you, Christian. I think Colm definitely mentioned Charles Taylor at the beginning. I know Mikkel did. I think we've spoken about this before. I just wanted to bring that into the discussion and ask what you got from this. So I went back to the politics of recognition last week, and though it's brilliant, I actually didn't find it to be very much help. Because it's essentially about cultural survival and cultural worth. So my question is really, what's the thing being recognised here? What is this recognition? The thing I draw from it is it's expressive. It's to do with the things that the state can say and the way that the state reflects the identity of groups. But partly, maybe it's a move away from, I think it's reconcilable with exactly the sort of Jacobin constitution that you describe, Cole. I don't think the kind of recognition that Taylor's describing sits apart from a state that projects a particular constitutional vision. So my reading of the politics of recognition, at least, was that we're quite a long way downstream from there. If we make this a principle about identity or culture, and we talked about that a moment ago, then yes, Taylor's front and centre. I actually don't see Taylor in what either of you have said, both in your presentations and what we've been speaking about for the last 10 minutes. Where does this come in for you?
I do see Taylor. I see him. But precisely because I don't see the separating out of identity working well, and that's maybe an interesting point of disagreement here. You see, I actually think that part of parity of esteem is you lot over there, you have a particular constitutional vision, you have a particular history, you hang around together, you have your own political parties, and whether that's Plaid in Wales or the SNP or or nationalists here, unionists here, whatever, there is a recognition of constitutional aspirations bound up with culture, bound up with identity, and for me, it's not realistic to separate them. And that's a potential problem. But luckily, because I see this as sort of a way of managing conflict and disagreement, it's perhaps less of a problem than for people looking for parity of esteem to be a more positive bridging gap. So I do see Taylor precisely because I see culture as very much part of the picture.
I think I see it in the nexus between identity recognition and dignity, going back to your mentioning dignity before, and that, I mean, there is a very particular kind of insult. Nobody likes being told that they're wrong, right? Okay, so I set to you my idea of the political good and you tell me it's wrong and you explain why. Nobody likes that. But at least when someone explains that you're wrong, you're doing them the courtesy of listening to them and explaining to them why you think they're wrong. But it's the lack of recognition. It's not that you're wrong, it's that you don't matter. That's the insult. It means that you are outside the bounds of what is acceptable. And Colin has stormed out of the room in disgust, but I was thinking about what he said about parity of esteem in the Scottish context. And I mean, if I were a Scottish nationalist, then I mean the excerpt I read between Cameron and Miliband, I mean, I would be offended by that. I would say, well, look, I mean, you're acting as if we're Nazis, you know. I mean, you're acting as if we're like completely beyond the pale. And in some elements of the English or British unionist imagination, Scottish nationalism is beyond the pale. But I think when you look at the substance of the argument, you can see why they would regard that as being insulting. So I think that it's the nexus of aspiration, identity, and recognition and dignity is what it's doing someone the courtesy of taking them seriously and saying that you are not cast out of the company because of your different way of thinking. And I was thinking then as well in the North American context, okay, so in Canada you've got the Anglophone, the Francophone, but you've also got the First Nations. And in the United States you have the various ways they call themselves, including the word Indian. I mean, there are ways in which Canada, and in particular the United States, cannot accommodate certain kinds of constitutional aspiration because it calls into question, again, the very basis of the state. I mean, the United States can, in a weird way, through the recognition of indigenous sovereignty and tribal lands and so forth. But this, first of all, I know nothing about the details of this, but also, you know, it's not, I think, what perhaps the most optimistic of the Native American population thought it might become. And so, you know, identity politics, as Chris mentioned earlier on, in its kind of annoying liberal sense, I think we can reject that out of hand. But there is something to the idea of not being agreed with, but being taken seriously and not being asked to leave the room.
Thank you. We have one small, tiny, weeny intervention from Chris. A question from Mikhail. Would anybody else like to ask a question? This is your last. Okay. Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for your tolerance, Madam Chair. I should say, Tom, by the way, thank you for bringing us together. This has been an absolutely wonderful day. And I have to say, I don't generally find conferences wonderful. So, but really, thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you for coming.
It was a pleasure to be here and also a pleasure to see it happening at Queen's. It's an important discussion, so thank you. The point I wanted to come back to, if I may, is this very interesting idea of it being an irritant that Colin mentioned. Because it seems to me that you're at loggerheads on that point, in the sense, and I just wanted to be clear that I'm right in that, because I think, Tom, you're saying it's not an irritant in either jurisdiction, either in the UK or in the Republic. And I have to say, I have long tried to be an irritant in many contexts. And in this context, I've never succeeded because there's a kind of, I don't go into the high circles of politics that Colin does. And so I have, I don't go to policy exchange and places like that. But the discussions that I have had, particularly before the election, that were, genuine, relatively moderate people getting together in private to think about what to do about the United Kingdom, particularly those who were concerned about the Union at that time, any time that Northern Ireland was brought up, you were sort of patted on the head. You weren't excluded from the conversation. It wasn't that. You were included in the conversation, but basically you were patted on the head. Well, that's exceptional, right? So it's nothing to say about Scotland. It's nothing to say about Wales. So I do want to come back to your point, Colin, because it seems to me it's the lack of being able to irritate in the British Constitution that's the problem here. And therefore, I'm very dubious about the idea that, at least in the British constitutional context, that parity of esteem can prove that big an irritant. The only irritant that I've actually seen working in the British Constitution was membership in the European Union, which was extraordinarily difficult to accommodate in the constitutional structure, and therefore was an irritant. And that didn't go so well.
Thank you, Chris. Let's take the last two questions together, if you don't mind. Sorry, Christian. So Michael at the front.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking speeches and talks. Well, you know that we really love criticizing French and French system. And from that point of view, we are very familiar with this rejection of the Jacobin, right? Republican model of Republican constitutional, Jacobin Republican. Also because many times it is perceived as that they get wrong equality with uniformism, no? But I was thinking now, it is something that I'm associating with that because, as Iwan knows, I was working on that. Is there not something like the Jacobin Republican approach has a universal vocation? No? I mean, if we can see constitutionalism as an ideology, we could say that it is cosmopolitan. So it is expansive. No? They are all the time speaking. They are not speaking about rights of French citizens, but rights of like human beings, no, like human rights, kind of les droits des citoyens, les droits de l'homme, no. So from that point of view, my question, and it is for both, can we think that constitutionalism as an ideology may constrain, may limit, may reduce political aspirations? I mean, all political aspirations are valid. Can we justify, and the parity of esteem is also included there. If we respect the rule of law, if we respect human rights also the collective expression of many of the rights, if we protect cultural rights, all secession demands, all secession things are really considered coherent with that, with the ethos, no, involved in constitutionalism as an ideology, that it is enhanced, no, with the ecological conscience, the ecological awareness, no. I mean, it's everything, because sometimes I have the impression that some secession are covering like a lack of solidarity, no? Well, just in the case of Spain, just the Basque Country and Catalan are the wealthiest regions in Spain, and they never say we want to have full autonomy, full sovereignty in our territory. They want to join the European Union. They feel very into the European Union, but they don't feel part of Spain, no? And that was my thought, sorry.
Thank you, Michael. And just one last question just behind you, Christian. Just thank you.
Okay, so you'll have to forgive me. This is more an attempt to follow along than a question. Okay. So given the context of dehumanization during the Troubles, could we not say that what parity of esteem is an institutionalized humanization effort? Idea being you've got a top-down ideological counterweight to grassroots dehumanization, right? So just to follow on from that, yep, it might be a figment of imagination to have it as an aspirational ideal, but if a nation's an imagined community, couldn't you then have that aspirational ideal part of the new Northern Irish national identity? Something to fail, but then create a boxing ring.
Great. Thank you very much. You have 90 seconds each to answer those three fascinating questions.
Don't tell two Corkmen that they have 90 seconds to speak. I think I'm intrigued by your phrase dehumanization. I think there's something to it, but I think in terms of the state's previous attitude towards the minority population, it wasn't one, I would say, of dehumanization, but of de-citizenization, depersonization. It's that by not conforming to state orthodoxy, you render yourself an unperson. And I think this goes back to what I was saying before about recognition and dignity, in that not conforming to state orthodoxy in terms of the state's conception of constitutional rectitude should not render you an unperson. And so I think I agree with you in that respect then, that the state has to recognize the legitimacy and decency and validity of a political aspiration that results ultimately in the extinction or alteration of the state. Michael, I was very interested as well by you mentioning the lack of solidarity as well, because yes, Catalonia and the Basque Country are some of the wealthiest regions of Spain. I think it's very interesting in the Irish and British-Irish context, the way in which this has altered over time as well, how Northern Ireland, the wealthiest part of Ireland at the time of partition, but then also the relative wealth and poverty of parts of Scotland, the fact that we mentioned earlier the demographic predominance of England within the UK. If you look back previously from the 1500s on, it wasn't always so lopsided, and so you get drawn into a problem of cause and effect there, which I think is also very difficult. And just Chris, well, first of all, thank you for your kind words, and thank you, Chris, and everyone else for coming and all the sterling work that has been done. On the issue of an irritant, I'm not sure we necessarily do disagree that much, or I'm going to give a very dissatisfying Misi-Mosi answer. I'm going to say that, yes, I think it is an irritant, and that's a good thing, because I think part of how I conceive of democracy in a sense follows Chantal Mouffe and others in that it's agonistic. Division isn't a bad thing. You know, people say, oh, we can't have that, it's divisive. Politics is divisive. When they vote in Westminster, the bell that calls them to the chamber is called the division bell. I mean, it's not a bad thing. The point of constitutionalism is to channel that division in a way that doesn't lead to bloodshed, doesn't lead to bad outcomes. So I think then that Parity of Esteem is an irritant. It irritates us because it forces us to look beyond ourselves and to not assume that our own epistemological confines are the only ones or the only legitimate ones. And on the issue, I mean, of whether Northern Ireland is an irritant in general, not just both communities. I mean, I've long suspected that if there were an independence referendum that passed in Ireland, they would be singing A Nation once again on the streets of Tunbridge Wells. Free at last. I don't know what you think about it, Colin.
Lots to say about that. Just since we've got this terrifying 5 o'clock, tomorrow morning begins at 9:30. I'm going to be very brief, can't give full answers. Because I think your point about the French Constitution is really interesting. I have a French friend, constitutional lawyer, who says, oh, we've been patronised by the Anglo-Americans about our Constitution for the last 50 years. Well, who's laughing now? He said to me recently, which I thought was a valid point for now. I think we need to take the Jacobean tradition seriously, intellectually. I think we have to take it seriously, more seriously than it's sometimes taken. And I think we owe it to ourselves, even if we don't like it, and many people don't like it in the Anglo-American world. It's alien, needs to be taken seriously. Chris, on the irritation, I can guarantee you have never seen a more irritated room than a policy exchange room with someone like me saying, you can't go into the CHR, it's in the Good Friday Agreement. The levels of irritation are off the scale. And that is seen as a parity of esteem concession. It is seen as a concession to those troublesome nationalists and as a concession to the peace process. and as something that is a real problem. You'll see Kemi Badenoch, as the Tory leader, hasn't committed to leaving the ECHR precisely because it's lurking there in the Good Friday Agreement. So Northern Ireland does function as an irritation, and interestingly, in my view, it is linked to parity of esteem being locked in there too, on that particular issue anyway.
Brilliant. I think that's a fantastic conclusion to a fantastic day. Thank you, everybody, for your questions and interventions. Thanks to all the speakers. Tomorrow morning begins at 9:30 sharp. So enjoy the sunny evening, and we look forward very much to seeing you in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.